Opening the center creates dynamic possibilities and immediately challenges black for central dominance. Sicilians immediately stake a claim to the center, creating dynamic imbalances from the outset. Initiating open lines and preparing kingside development, this knight actively contests central squares. Instantly contesting the center's crucial squares, NC6 establishes a dynamic, flexible defense that can transition into various Sicilian setups. Opening the center immediately challenges black's flank control and invites tactical fireworks. Opening the central files is the immediate consequence of this capture, inviting sharp play. Recapturing with the knight immediately asserts central influence and prepares rapid development, creating a dynamic imbalance. Developing the knight to f6 challenges the central pawn and prepares for castling, a solid reply in this Sicilian structure. Developing the knight here exerts pressure along the open d-file, aiming to influence the center and prepare for castling. Solidifying central control and preparing for development, this pawn advance subtly contests the e4 square and opens diagonals. Developing the bishop to g5 immediately pins the knight on f6, creating a subtle pressure and potential for tactical exchanges that could disrupt black's central pawn structure. This aggressive deployment anticipates black's likely pawn advances and aims to gain a tempo advantage in the ensuing skirmish, potentially opening lines towards the black king. Securing the central pawn with a solid structure now takes precedence, preparing to challenge the bishop's influence and free the queenside for potential development. Shielding the queen and preparing for queenside castling, this move elegantly integrates the monarch into the defensive and offensive structure, while simultaneously eyeing the c3 knight's defensive role for potential future tactical sequences. Challenging the bishop's influence directly, black seeks to clarify the central tension and perhaps open lines for peace activity. But this pawn advance might create a subtle long-term weakness on the light squares around the king if not carefully supported. Sacrificing the bishop to shatter black's pawn structure, especially the d6 pawn, creates immediate weaknesses that white aims to exploit. This trade, while seemingly equal in material, opens lines and compromises black's central control, setting the stage for a dynamic attacking game. The resulting doubled f-pawns, though a long-term liability, grant white more influence over the e-file and can be a target for future pressure. Opening that g-file creates immediate attacking potential, but sacrifices pawn structure around your king, exposing it to potential future assaults. Launching the king's safety to the queenside boldly reconfigures the pawn structure, creating imbalances and opening lines for immediate initiative, though it leaves the monarch exposed to potential counterplay along the newly formed open files. Challenging white's queenside expansion, this pawn advance begins to contest crucial space, potentially preparing a counterplay along the b-file or even a strategic rook lift later on. Disrupting black's pawn structure with this capture opens lines for white's pieces and forces black to make a difficult decision about recapturing, potentially weakening their kingside further. Opening the b-file provides immediate counterplay and aims to disrupt white's queenside pawn structure, a promising dynamic trade-off for the doubled pawns. Flipping the pawn structure to the kingside, f4 aims to create dynamic attacking potential by opening the f-file, potentially pressuring black's uncastled king and controlling more central space, though it weakens the king's diagonal. Unbalancing white's pawn structure with the recapture has created weaknesses, and this advance now targets the exposed queen's side, forcing white to address the immediate threat and disrupting their potential development plans by creating queenside tension. Asserting control over the crucial diagonal and preparing for an aggressive kingside advance, white's bishop now eyes the unsuspecting black king, while simultaneously bolstering the pawn chain and potentially setting up a future d4-d5 pawn push to open lines. Solidifying the kingside pawn structure while preparing to castle allows black to avoid immediate tactical complications, but it does create a slightly cramped position for the light-squared bishop, potentially limiting its scope for future action. Preparing to storm the kingside, white subtly reinforces the f4 pawn, anticipating a potential advance that could open lines against black's weakened structure. Unlocking the b-file with the rook aims to contest open lines and pressure white's castled king. The queen now retreats, allowing the f-pawn to advance further and build a formidable pawn chain on the kingside, simultaneously offering some breathing room for the rook on e1 to potentially join the kingside assault. The black king's journey begins, a bold venture from its usual sanctuary, hinting at a desire to escape the oppressive diagonal of white's bishop and potentially participate in the middle game skirmishes. This maneuver prioritizes king safety over immediate pawn structure concerns, recognizing the inherent weaknesses created on the dark squares after gxf6. It's a choice that transforms the king into an active participant, albeit one exposed to the lingering threats along the e-file and the open d-file. Shifting the bishop to this square aims to develop a defensive eye on the queenside pawn structure, while simultaneously creating opportunities for more active piece play down the file. Perhaps hinting at a future pawn push with the idea is to solidify the king's defense and prepare for potential offensive maneuvers, considering black's rather passive development so far. The queen's repositioning to c5 aims to exploit the weakened dark squares around white's king while eyeing the c-file. Unleashing the queen from behind its pawn shield, white aims to directly challenge black's king with a sudden influx of attacking pieces into the kingside. Black initiates a dynamic pawn thrust, aiming to disrupt white's queenside structure and potentially open lines for their own pieces, though it concurrently weakens the b7 pawn and the long diagonal. Unlocking attacking potential along the e-file, this pawn thrust dramatically escalates the battle for central control, potentially exposing black's king even further and disrupting the harmony of their defenses. Suddenly seizing the center, black challenges white's pawn thrust and aims to unlock their queenside mobility. Unleashing a bold pawn thrust, white ignites the kingside, aiming to fracture black's pawn chain and expose the monarch through a direct assault on the kingside structure. The pawn sacrifice here opens the e-file for counterplay, but at the cost of weakening black's kingside pawn structure. White will likely exploit the doubled f-pawns and the open lines to launch an attack. The king now feels a bit exposed, and the queenside play might not be enough to compensate for the defensive issues developing. The queen's audacious foray to h5 seizes the initiative, directly threatening a dangerous mating net on the kingside, while simultaneously exerting pressure along the e-file and reinforcing the f5 pawn's precarious existence. Bolstering the d5 pawn's defense, this move prepares for future pawn advances and solidifies the central structure. Unleashing a pawn storm on the kingside, this aggressive advance aims to shatter black's pawn shield and expose the king, creating immediate attacking chances. A bold exchange that dramatically alters the pawn structure, opening a diagonal for the king that was previously well defended, and simultaneously offering a potential pawn sacrifice to seize initiative. This opens up tactical possibilities on the kingside, and the subsequent play will hinge on how effectively both sides can utilize the newly created complexities. Unleashing an offensive storm, white sacrifices a pawn to shatter black's pawn structure, opening vital lines towards the enemy king. The bishop reclaims a vital diagonal, aiming to disrupt white's kingside ambition and potentially exploit the weakened pawn structure. A bold repositioning, the bishop now eyes the kingside where white's king is exposed, initiating a fascinating positional tug-of-war. Rather than passively defending, the bishop seizes the initiative, anchoring itself on a crucial diagonal and forcing white to reconsider their aggressive plans. An interesting choice, this placement allows black to contest the dark squares and prepares for potential kingside advances. Shifting focus to the central dark squares, the bishop establishes an attacking outpost, subtly hinting at future tactical opportunities. Unleashing a knight's potential, this aggressive repositioning aims to pierce black's weakened kingside pawn structure and exploit the open g-file that was just created, creating a dynamic imbalance where material advantage for black is secondary to white's attacking initiative. The queen's retreat is a logical reaction to the king's pawn's aggressive advance, aiming to regroup and prepare for a defense against white's encroaching pieces. Unbalancing the pawn structure, This knight's sortie immediately targets the doubled pawns and hints at a potential breakthrough, forcing black to confront a tactical dilemma with exposed weaknesses. Reclaiming material and centralizing the queen after that aggressive pawn thrust creates immediate tactical ripples and sharpens the battle for the center's integrity. A bold thrust to seize the initiative, aiming to disrupt black's delicate pawn structure and pry open lines towards the exposed king. Unleashing the rook onto the g-file, black aims to create attacking potential, a bold decision given white's well-centralized knight and menacing e-pawn. This aggressive maneuver sacrifices pawn structure for dynamic counterplay, potentially disrupting white's king's safety if the pressure can be sustained. Establishing an ironclad grip on the central files and reinforcing the pawn chain are the immediate priorities with this deployment of the rook. Pushing that rook to the flank aims to disrupt white's queenside buildup, but it feels like a desperate attempt to find counterplay when the center is so exposed. It relinquishes control of the crucial g-file, potentially opening avenues for white's pieces to swarm your vulnerable king. Consider the implications of leaving the h-pawn undefended and how white might exploit the newly created weaknesses on the king side. This maneuver, while active, might be a significant positional concession. Challenging the open g-file, white boldly confronts black's pawn chain and attempts to disrupt the defensive setup around the black king, aiming to exploit any immediate weaknesses. A brilliant cross-check that forces white to concede the d-file and consider their king's safety, highlighting how initiative can be seized even when materially disadvantaged. Unlocking the c-file for potential infiltration while simultaneously defending against the pesky g-pawn advance, this maneuver aims to reorganize white's rook presence and potentially prepare for a coordinated attack on black's beleaguered kingside. Finally, the rooks are unleashed to contest the open file, injecting a much-needed dose of dynamism into a position that had grown somewhat stagnant. This maneuver promises to exploit white's slightly misplaced king and potentially crack open the queenside defenses. A risky gambit to stir up the queenside, sacrificing pawn structure for potential attacking lines. This maneuver boldly repositions the queen, inviting immediate complications and daring black to prove the safety of their king. A decisive moment arrives as the queens are exchanged, simplifying the battlefield and ushering in a new phase of play where the pawn structure and king's safety will become paramount. Opening up the h-file presents a dual-edged sword, potentially accelerating piece activity, but simultaneously exposing your monarch to unforeseen dangers that could be exploited by sharp eyes. With all major pieces off the board, the game enters a simplified realm where pawn structure and king safety become paramount. This exchange dramatically reshapes the battlefield, trading a powerful rooks for one that, while active, was also a target, paving the way for a potentially easier conversion for white in the ensuing pawn race. The rook now claims the open file, a crucial step toward activating this piece and threatening the vulnerable opposing king. The black king, after a lengthy journey through the early middle game, now bravely ventures towards the center, aiming to activate its defensive capabilities amidst the rubble of the pawn structures. The rook repositions to prepare for a potential invasion along the second rank, aiming to exploit the slightly exposed black king by creating threats against its immediate surroundings. The pawn storm on the kingside is now stalled. The attempt to open lines against the black king has been neatly parried, leaving white's structure somewhat compromised and his king still exposed. Unlocking the kingside pawn majority becomes paramount with this advance, aiming to disrupt black's somewhat passive defensive setup and create a dynamic play. The rook's advance to the 8th rank is a bold assertion of a long-dormant attacking potential, seeking to disrupt white's rather passive king's defense and potentially create counterplay along the open file. Anchoring the king becomes paramount as the board simplifies. KD secures a vital square and readies the monarch for potential defensive duties or even a surprising foray into the center if the opportunity arises. Bringing the king to the center of the board here, though seemingly passive, aims to consolidate forces and prepare for a potential breakthrough or defense from that central position. The monarch abandons its secure castled position, embracing a risky central deployment, which could expose it to further complications, but aims to activate it in the ensuing, somewhat peculiar pawn structure. The black monarch, now a target on an open diagonal, scrambles for safety, attempting to reposition into a more defended square amidst the pawn storm. Solidifying the pawn structure here is paramount, anchoring your central presence and preparing to push the king towards greater safety and activity in the ensuing endgame. Unbalancing the pawn structure with this pawn advance creates immediate pressure on white's queenside, potentially opening lines for black's rook and bishop that were previously tied down. Re-establishing the rook on its starting file aims to bring it back into the central fray, potentially supporting an advance on the kingside or preparing for exchanges that might simplify the position. Reclaiming initiative, the bishop maneuvers to a more active square, eyeing the central pawns and threatening to disrupt white's precarious pawn structure. The king, now exposed, seeks refuge amidst the advancing pawns, hoping to escape the immediate threats that loom. The bishop's repositioning to the center, while seemingly active, invites further pawn advancement from white and creates a slight blockade on black's own queenside pawn structure.